So I think that our next presentation is going to be like a brilliant continuation of this discussion. It's all about mindfulness and all about meanings. It's called How Can Interpretive Experiences Make People More Mindful? Of course, the presenter is our Thorsten Ludwig, a man who many of you already know. Thorsten has been the managing director of Interpret Europe for 6 years, from 2015 to April 2021, and he was awarded the European Union Altiero Spinelli Prize in 2017 for launching the initiative Engaging Citizens with Europe's Cultural Heritage. For all of us who are never tired of discussing and testing new approaches to heritage interpretation, we always like what Thorsten has to say. And we are now going to hear about mindfulness versus mindlessness. What is mindfulness and what kind of mindfulness is most relevant for heritage interpretation, and how all that could reflect on tourism. So Thorsten, please, the stage is yours.
Thanks a lot, Eva. I try to connect my presentation. I'm still deactivated, it says. Yeah, no. You see it, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot for your nice introduction. This is a challenge, actually, because the previous panel discussion brought up so many interesting thoughts to discuss and to think about, and I hope that you can focus on this now. The point I'm talking about is mindfulness in connection with heritage interpretation. And the reason why we brought this up was that on the website of Interpret Europe, it said to make heritage more meaningful to people and people more mindful towards our shared values. And while we were discussing in previous years a lot about meaning and meaningfulness, we did not say much about mindful and mindfulness. And for that reason, at the beginning of the year, I was asked whether I could explain something about this, and I prepared a webinar to come up with some thoughts and to elaborate on it. And actually this brought more questions up than it brought answers up. And I can tell you, I'm still in that state where I'm elaborating on things and come up with many questions and not too many answers. So be aware that it is more a challenge to look for where we go and what to do than it is any conclusion on this subject. I want to follow 3 questions within my presentation. And the first question is what the quality of whole interpretive experiences are. So I would like to bring that a little bit back into mind. The second is how the concept of mindfulness could support them in a way. And the third is how this could suit to other concepts we discussed at Interpret Europe during previous years. The first one, what is the quality of whole interpretive experiences? I want to quote Freeman Tilden, you know I like to quote him, for he said that what we are doing is a kind of elective education that is superior in some respects to that of the classroom. He said that we have the thing itself so that we come to the point, to the place, that we can experience the place. That's something like what we would call today our unique selling proposition. So he was much elaborating on that and much highlighting that. And if we consider what are aspects of such a whole experience, what we do in our training program is we are basically highlighting 5. The first is, of course, this physical aspect, what Freeman Tilden was talking about, that we experience the things with our whole body, that we really have authentic experiences on site. The second, of course, the intellectual aspect. So what are we doing with it? The knowledge. The third, the emotional aspect. What does it do with us? And these 3 first points are basically what you know maybe from Pestalozzi, head, heart, and hands, or the classical terms, what an experience is. The fourth is the spiritual component, which sounds a little bit like, ooh, it's going far, but I checked actually how often Tilden used the spiritual component. He did it a lot throughout his book, and 20% of all protected areas in the UNESCO scheme has as one reason that there is a spiritual component in. Spiritual component for me starts with when we are meaning making and when it's really going deeper than just having an emotional experience, then we feel it touches our deep inside. So that's what I'm considering as this. And the last one is the social component. This is the only one which has nothing to do with the individual. This has actually to do with either sharing experiences or reflecting upon experiences we had. So these 5 aspects make a whole interpretive experiences when we're talking about this. And I will not say too much about the intellectual and the emotional part in this presentation. I will more talk about the physical aspect first, and then about the spiritual and social aspect, but this more within the context of mindfulness, because we do not have too much time to elaborate on it. And so I tried to connect this. For the physical experience, this is very simple for everybody to understand. We have our 5 senses. We see, we hear, we touch, we taste, we smell. We have also some internal senses, which we usually ignore, which is position, balance, temperature. It's also pain. You see, I faded that a bit down because I felt it's not so relevant for what we want to achieve in heritage interpretation. But these others, that you have a sense of a place, that you feel at a place, and you have a position to the place. This is quite important and quite interesting in the context of a whole physical learning experience. I quoted this from a study on the brain. It says experiential learning activities are by definition multisensory because they stimulate 2 or more memory systems in separate brain regions. And you see that I highlighted the separate brain regions. I did this because some of you might know that learning happens within the neurons in our brain and within the pathways between the neurons. And the more those pathways are used and in the more regions information is stored, the more do we remember things. But the classical example of what we could remember very good is in our episodic memory, we remember experiences. So you can remember experiences at places which are long, long ago, why it's much more difficult for you to remember whatever the presentations from last year's conference or something like this. So the experience where all the senses were involved, where different regions of the brain were involved when the information was stored, they have much longer impact than other things that we just listen to. Which are in the semantic memory usually. I copied this scan, which I found quite nice. Such colorful scans are always nice, of course, and the question is always, what do they actually say? And I really encourage you to look at the quote below. You can see this later in the recording, or you can see it in the paper, in the proceedings, and follow it up and see what it actually says. But basically, it is about a student at the left side who is sitting a test and a student at the right side who is sitting a test after doing a walk. And what you see is that his brain is much more active. So the more your whole body is involved in something, the more active your brain gets, the more awake you are. And you will see later that this gets quite important when we're talking about mindfulness. John Medina, a biologist who is quite popular, and we use his book Brain Rules in our training program. He said that the brain appears to be designed to solve problems related to surviving in an unstable outdoor environment and to do so in nearly constant motion. So this is what he suggests is when the brain optimal works. And you can see, if you consider what are the principles of heritage interpretation, you will see that there are some parallels. So to solve problems, to challenge people, to provoke people, all of this is a little bit included in this definition. And you might know this scheme, this model from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, a psychologist who said that that there is a flow channel between boredom and anxiety. So when we are bored, when we're not really challenged, then we do not really want to learn. And when we are too much challenged, so that our skills are not sufficient to the challenge, then we also do not learn. So we always should try to stay in this flow channel with between boredom and anxiety, so to say. And this obviously is different for different people. So for some people, boredom starts pretty early, and for other people quite late. And some people feel they don't have the skills at an early level, others later. So this needs to be adapted, of course. But this is a general principle, that people are awake, that they learn, that they deal with new things, requires that they are in this flow channel. This is a very helpful model, and you can look it up at flow. Flow was a very popular concept in the 1990s. You find a lot of videos also at YouTube about that if you want to look it up. And Medina said, and this is a little bit provoking now, if you wanted to create an education environment that was directly opposed to what the brain was good at doing, you probably would design something like a classroom. So it's the opposite, sitting on the chair, listening, then everybody of us knows that that gets not so exciting, and we are not really completely involved and engaged in this. It's much easier to escape. So after I'm talking half an hour, I'm pretty sure some of you will lean back and escape, and because they're not really engaged in the process. So I think this is clear, and everybody of us knows this. So what we have as an asset definitely is that we have these places that encourage people to really get engaged and to really get into this process, also to get into the flow channel between challenge and anxiety, as you can see, and to look for these places also at our sites, to consider what are the places that give the most challenge to the people, what are the places that inspire them most, that inspire all their senses. This is actually one of the main tasks we have. So it is not just to look at the place where we can stand comfortably and talk about something. The place itself needs to inspire the people, and we should more support this process of the people actually interpreting. I come back to this later because I feel this is sort of a shift we discussed in previous years, that we said we should more turn to the people as interpreters and think, what is our role then if the people interpret and not we just interpret for the people? So there are many inspirational sites that do this. I could continue showing such pictures now for a while. I would like to point out this one because I like very much, because it's a museum, actually. And I had the pleasure to visit this after a conference in Sarajevo 2 years before, together with Angus. And I was impressed by the garden around the museum mainly, because obviously the idea was to inspire people. So not just look them at the glass cases or whatever, but then give them the place, the space, and the inspiration to consider this. And nature is very good in this. So the connection between nature and culture obviously makes a big point in this concern. So to create inspirational atmospheres and to let the people experience is really critical. And I would like to encourage you to think about some of, this is a very old building, obviously, I think it's the middle of the 19th century, encourage you to consider some of the newer buildings and what inspiration they give. Some do this in a very good way. Some give very much space for people to communicate, to get into exchange, but some also have a sort of like an not inspirational architecture in not really inspirational surroundings. So when we're talking about interpretive planning, of course, we need to have such things in mind. Any heritage site, especially World Heritage site like here in Dubrovnik, have something magic and have something special. And when we enter this and want to see what is behind this gate, this is the most fascinating part of the experience. And the point is, and this is the subject of the conference, the point is, how can we provide the place in a way that really the people get this inspiration, that really the people get this experience and have the opportunity to learn, to develop. And we know that the reality is often that, especially at such places, as you can see here, the opportunity is not really huge to do this. So how to deal with such phenomena of really massive tourism is a challenge, especially, of course, in such places that are, Dubrovnik is regularly flooded by cruise ships. Venice, it's the same. So we know these places, and we know that also there are people who are concerned about it and think what they can do. This is where the conference fits in, definitely. We have situations where, as a poor guide, you can only try to make the best out of the situation. And when you remember what I said before about the whole interpretive experience, you see that this is very limited in such situations, because you're more dealing with not losing the group, stick to the guide and find your way through the crowds than to the real experience of the heritage. So the second part, and here now comes the mindfulness aspect in, how mindfulness supports the interpretive experiences and how these two things work together. I copied this very simple definition of mindfulness from the Oxford Dictionary: the quality or state of being conscious or aware of something. So being attended, being aware of something is what mindfulness says, but you can say they tried to get away without too much concerns in this, because mindfulness, if you look it up in, if you search in the internet for mindfulness, you end very quickly at meditation. And at the moment, it has very much to do with the self, with my personal resilience, you could say, with my stress resistance. So all these things are at the moment far up on the agenda if you're talking about mindfulness. And this is not actually the main point why I feel mindfulness is important in the interpretive context. The person who is most related to mindfulness in the literature usually is Alan Langer from Harvard University. Alan Langer published the book Mindfulness, also somewhere here in the 1980s. I think it was published in 1989. And in this book, she, for the first time, was really elaborating on the concept of mindfulness. If you see in the left column, there is, I put this first because it's easier to explain what mindlessness is, okay? So if you're mostly stick to the past, if you follow rules, if you know the rules, if you have your perspective, your way how to look at things, then you usually are sure what you do is correct. It is not objectively necessarily, but it gives you the assurance that you are true in what you're doing. So you know what you do it your way, and it's much governed by routines. So this is mindlessness, which means you do not learn much, okay? So you just practice what you learned before or what you think you learned before. You do not learn many more new things. And of course, the opposite then is mindfulness, where you're in the present, where you're awake, where you're sensitive to the context you're actually in at the moment, and where you're engaged. And you see what there is a big parallel to what I was talking about before, about the whole interpretive experiences. Of course, all of this contributes to that. And I would highlight that it's not, when I say this, it's not to foster only mindfulness and to say people who are mindless, they are in a very bad shape, because most of the time, when we are honest, we are mindless. So mindlessness means we follow routines, and most of the day we need to follow routines, otherwise we wouldn't be able to cope with the day. So our everyday life is for some more, for others less. For some people, actually, most of the day is about routines. Most of the day they are following routines, every day the same until the evening when the work starts, and then they do maybe something different when they do not follow routines again. So the routines also relieve us, and we know when we are, for example, when we are riding a bicycle, it's quite good that we know how to do this and that it's a routine, because then we can talk to someone next to us, which we cannot do when we do this is in a very mindful state, which is basically when we're learning to ride a bicycle. But what makes it now interesting is that in the tourism context, people are out of their routines. So the more we get them out of their routines, the more they can become mindful, the more they can learn. And you can imagine now, if you look at tourism, let's say you're going with a tour bus from one destination to the next, you had an information before where you were going, you basically know the pictures which are waiting there for you. So you hop off the bus, take your picture with your own phone, go on the bus again and continue. This is something where you transfer the routine processes from everyday life just into the holidays. So there is nothing which is really encouraging or inspiring. And if you're talking about tourism that allows to become more mindful, that allows to have whole experiences, this needs to look different. And I'm sure at the conference, there will be several opportunities to discuss how this should look, and also to discuss, as has been done in the previous panel discussion, what can we do to convince also the tourism business that this is a good idea to do this. One name which you will always come about when you're talking about mindfulness in the interpretive context, and this is now this one, is the book from Gianna Moscardo. Gianna will be our keynote speaker on Monday. And she actually brought the mindfulness subject, you can say, into interpretation with her book, Making Visitors Mindful, which was the end of the 1990s. It's actually 20 years ago. So it's really something which has some history in our profession, but which hasn't been covered so much during the last years. She wrote, mindfulness is likely to occur in novel or unfamiliar situations where no script exists, when a script is interrupted or where considerable effort or cost to the individual is involved. So she actually also backed this by research. So in her book, there are some charts where you see there is a lot of research work behind what she says. And again, I would like to bring Freeman Tilden back on the stage, who said that we should put our visitor in possession of at least one disturbing idea that may grow into a fruitful interest. So this idea of interruption, of disturbing, of provoking, of getting something new in is also what he was advocating for in several parts of his book, Interpreting Our Heritage. And Gianna now tried to find out how communication should look if it is coming to a state of mindfulness in the end. So you see this table, variety, change, multisensory media, so all these things, what we are talking about when we're talking about interpretation, how should they look to increase the interest of visitors, to get them away from low levels of fatigueness and to make them mindful in the end, or to give them the opportunity to become mindful in the end. And of course, she does the opposite. She says what does not help to do this. So repetition and unisensory media, traditional exhibits, and so on and so on. So this leads to more mindlessness in our activities. This is what I really recommend you to look this up, even if it's 20 years old. But I would say for many professional interpreters, this is common sense, and we are working with this definitely all the time. Where it gets interesting is where we go away from design of media, which is what we are discussing here, more to a way how people communicate on sites, around sites, what role the interpreter has, what role the people have who come, what role local people have. There it gets more and more interesting, and there we can extend this concept of mindfulness beyond just designing media that that the people do not get tired from watching them, to how really engage people at the site and with other people. So that are discussions we have since some time time now, also at last year's conference, or where we said we wanted to engage local communities and people from local communities and involve them. So this is I would say, a key challenge we have at the moment at the interpretive profession. And here mindfulness can contribute to this discussion. In terms of mindful tourism, Jana says sustainable tourism and recreation are most likely to result from visitors who are active, interested, questioning, and capable of reassessing the way they view the world. So we should give the opportunities to the people to unfold exactly these points if we want to increase mindfulness. So getting there more active than passive and triggering interest, provoking. So all these things help us to make people more mindful. I would say this person is sort of like a mindful tourist who said, I'll acquaint myself with the glaciers and wild gardens to get as near to the heart of the world as I can, which many of you know, of course, was John Muir when he first referred to interpretation. And we use this quote very often. And we could ask whether he was not the first mindful heritage interpreter, because of course he was in this state where he was looking for the whole experience. He was an ideal, as we all know. Not every tourist hopping out of a bus has the same ambitions as John Muir has, but to go in this direction and to try to foster those models is something that helps us to that people become more mindful. And I wanted to mention, by the way, that when this mindfulness literature was created, so when Jana was working in the 1990s, this was actually also the time when David Lawson wrote Meaningful Interpretation, so connecting hearts and minds to places as a subtitle. So this connection between meaningfulness and mindfulness has also a longer tradition. The book was published in 2003, but it was actually, he was working on it very much in the 1990s. I would like to go a little bit deeper, because we are talking, as I said before, that the spiritual aspect is an aspect that has an influence on a whole experience. And some of you might know that mindfulness, especially when you're talking about meditation and this direction, has a Buddhist tradition, so it has Buddhist roots. And I would like to read a quote to you from Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist monk. It's quite popular. So just look at this flower, and the quote is, the flower cannot exist by itself alone. It has to interbe with soil, rain, weeds, and insects. There is no being, there is only interbeing. Looking deeply into a flower, we see that the flower is made of non-flower elements. We can describe the flower as being full of everything. There is nothing that is not present in the flower. We see sunshine, we see rain, we see clouds, we see the earth, and we also see time and space in the flower. The whole cosmos has come together in order to help the flower manifest herself. The flower is full of everything except of one thing, a separate self, a separate identity. So that's quite provoking, I would say, because when you consider, I said this before, that today mindfulness is often connected to the self, to improving the self and to self-resilience. He makes up a very, very big picture. So he brings it in a very wide context. I underlined here interbeing as the central word. And in this sheet, the separate self. So the interbeing and the separate self are two very different things from the point of view of this Buddhist monk. And he much tries to show that everything, every life, everybody of us is basically a manifestation of other things. So we consist of other things. We cannot imagine ourselves without our context. We live in our context, and this is what we need to really accept and to actually live. And this, I feel, opens the field a little bit. I do not want to go too deep into this, and I do not want to become esoteric at the point, but it gives us another perspective, because it says that we can imagine that what we do when we are interpreting is we are in interaction, not just with the side, we are in interaction with other people, we are in interaction with everything around us. And to emphasize this a little bit more when we are considering of how we plan for interpretation, I feel is quite useful. I took this picture, I think 30 years ago, no, 40 years ago, from in a national park in Germany, from a little boy. And I was in environmental education at that time, and we ran environmental education programs, and he found this antler of a raw deer on a forest trail. And you see now, this boy is looking at this antler. So if you consider the words which this Buddhist monk just said before, there is a relationship, obviously, between the boy and this. There is a relationship to the situation. You see this other boy peeking over his shoulder. So he has his own ideas. So all of this is a process going on in this context. And this is a process which has a lot to do with being aware with the whole experience, and also with mindfulness in the sense as I described it before. And based on this, I would like to offer you a more complicated definition now than the one I shown you previously on mindfulness from the Oxford Dictionary. This is from Daniel Siegel. Daniel Siegel is from University of California, and he is a psychiatrist actually. And has a lot of, he's very popular. So his book Mindsight is also very popular. He also wrote a very nice book for young people. So how the minds of young people work and how to work with this. So it's really a treasure box, his literature. And he suggested that the human mind is a relational and embodied process that regulates the flow of energy and information. Sorry, this sounds very complicated, but if you consider the picture of the boy you've seen before, you say relational means that the mind of the boy actually is related to what he's doing and what is surrounding him. So the antler he just found, the path in the forest itself, the boy behind him. So all of this is the relation in the context in which this happens. And we can provide this context. We cannot do this when we can only partly do this when we're sitting at home in front of a screen, obviously. So we can provide this context, we can't provide this relation. He says it's an embodied process. Embodied means it's part of our whole body, so it's not just the brain. He says interestingly that the brain is basically a tool of the mind. So the mind is the process, which was for me a very new thought when I first read it, that it's not something fixed, but that it's something continuously going on and continuously changing our mind. And it's a regulator which regulates, he says here, the flow of energy and information, which means how much energy do we put on something? How much attention do we want to put on something? How much energy do we take in? And again, how much information do we give and how much information do we want to receive? So all of that's regulated by our mind. So it's a bigger picture of the mind. And if we look at what we're doing, actually, the very practical things in interpretive practice, against this background, we have another scope on it, which I feel is quite interesting. And I can only encourage you, even if it looks a little bit weird at the moment, and you say, how deep is this going? I can only encourage you to really think a little bit about it and what it does. We have the question I said before, the mind is more a process. The question, is the mind somewhere placed in our brain, is a very interesting question, but Daniel Siegel says that it is, and that it is mainly in the prefrontal cortex, which has some functions which are aligned to what we actually say the mind is doing usually. Siegel has a very nice way to explain the brain and how it evolved. He says, if we imagine we have the hand, And beyond the hand, we have the brain stem. So this is our spine, basically. And our reptile brain, so the earliest development points in the brain are inside our palm. And then we have the limbic system in the brain, which is still inside, but which developed when the mammals developed on the earth. And then we have the cortex, which is above everything. And you all know that the cortex is the most developed part of the brain. So this is basically what the human brain distinguishes from other brain, that is so much developed and so much elaborated. And at the front, this is the frontal cortex, and beyond the fingernails, this is where all these functions are that usually are assigned to the mind. If you look at it from the side, it might roughly remind you to a brain. I feel this is a very nice way how to remember how our brain evolved, the human brain. And within this prefrontal cortex, we have now a lot of functions, which I will not relate to all of them, of course, but basically it is all that you see: attuned communication, emotional balance. This basically happens when we talk to each other, and we do not really notice, and we are communicating very much with each other, and we do not notice what communication actually is going on. It's a very, very complex system, and you notice it if you meet someone whose senses in this concern are disturbed and who's not reacting like you would expect him or her to react, like smiling a little bit too late, or being a little bit too noisy, or such things, such disturbances which are really, really obvious, but we do not really recognize them if everything works smooth. So even talking to each other from face to face is something which has a lot to do with all these things that are going on in our mind. And at the right side, you see these points like empathy, insight, morality, intuition. So all this is subject to the prefrontal cortex. You might know studies where people lost, or where the prefrontal cortex of people was damaged in an accident, and they can act as they did before, but just their way how to communicate and how to behave has completely changed. So this is these are the functions we could look at if we think, what can we do to organize our interpretation, to plan interpretive processes? How can we use this, and how can they support this? One main point, obviously, in this context is empathy. And we have very different kinds of empathy. You see here, Siegel is distinguishing 5 different types of empathy. And all of this are supports, I feel, when we are thinking about how to set up interpretive services. We could consider how much do they feed to these different types of empathy. We could do this with all these other points Siegel was bringing up in the previous chart, which obviously I will not do here because it would take much too long and we cannot go so deep as we should in this context. But you can imagine that this is really a cornucopia of inspiration and of ideas, how we can improve our work in interpretation. One key word that Siegel uses very much is integration. Again, he has 8 different types of integration you could deal with, which I will not show here. But his main idea is that the process, the whole process of going somewhere, visiting a place, or dealing with it is a question of integration. So we integrate ourselves as visitors now. We integrate ourselves with the surroundings, with the people there, with the local people, with everything. So the main task we should have is to allow and to foster this integration. And this, I feel, again, is something which is very valuable. If we put this on top of our agenda when we're writing interpretive plans, what opportunities do we create for people to integrate? This is something that's very interesting to elaborate. Integration, Siegel says, is the middle way between chaos and rigidity, the flow of independent voices linked together in harmony that maximizes both complexity and vitality. This is the essence of integration. And the picture I've shown you before, he likes these pictures very much. I mean, not this one because that I've taken this, but he always compares it with choirs and orchestras where people get together in harmony, where they find a way to harmonize. And the idea that we bring people to places that they, for example, visit local people, and that our task is to look how they could harmonize, even if they might have contradicting views on the world. This is something I feel is very helpful, and that could be again an inspiration how to consider our planning and interpretation. So this is a list that I just put together. So this is not supported by direct research or whatever. You could find your own points from what I was talking before. But these were the points I came up with, where I say, if we want to help people to become mindful, we need to help them to be awake and engaged. So everything that helps to get to engage them is good. We need to give them difficult stimuli, and we need to give them the opportunity to select from those different stimuli. We should encourage them to be open-minded and to you remember this word, so to be just between the things and not sure of whatever position they might have. We should strive for resonance and integration so that they resonate with the place, feel the sense of place, and integrate to other people, to the place. We should inspire them to look at things from different perspectives, which means our role as facilitators is asked in that context. So not just present them information, but also encourage them to come up with their own thoughts and to get into an exchange about that. We need to take care that we do not overwhelm them by stimuli or perspective, which is especially challenging in the tourism area, where, of course, we all know that people, the tourists do not come to sites because they want to join an educational training or whatever. So we need to do this, by the way, which we always do in non-formal learning, so not to overstrain them. We should encourage them to exchange their own experiences, actually on-site and previous experiences, and reflect them and share meaning they attach to the site and the compassion for the site and for each other. So these are points, most of them, all of you who work in interpretation, most of them are pretty familiar to you. So you would not say, wow, that's a completely new insight. But I feel that the combination of that points gives a little bit a different focus to what we're doing. And I feel it's worth to follow that track a bit and see what inspirations our profession can get from it. Which brings me to the last point, to the last chapter. We were discussing several things at Interpret Europe in previous years, and the question is, how do these ideas contribute to that? In what context are they to it? And I brought up some sheets that more or less show the context, and they are again not an answer on anything, they are just questions related to it, but they show that this idea of mindfulness and whole experiences is pretty much linked to what we discussed in previous years. I would start with this one. Freeman Tilden wrote in his book about interpretation, and he suggested different ways how interpretation can take place. He suggested first that people interpret for themselves. So you find a lot of passages in the book where he shows example how people were encouraged to interpret. So it's them interpreting, it's not us interpreting for them. I feel this is very important, and you might remember also the quote from John Muir, "I'll interpret the rocks." Yeah, he was interpreting, so that the person, the individual, is interpreting and is growing from this interpretation, is developing. A second way Tilden described interpretation is that interpreters interpret for people. We're quite familiar to this. So we do the interpretation and the people are listening to us, and we convince them or do not convince them. So we do our best to interpret in a good way for the people, but they are more recipients in that context. And there's the third way. that interpreters communicate the interpretation of others to people. And actually, if we look at reality, in many cases, this is actually what happens. And this is also what Tilden, that is the kind of interpretation Tilden most emphasized in his book, which makes perfect sense because this book was written for the US National Park Service, and the National Park Service has rangers, and the rangers have an employer, and the employer suggests what to do, and they do their best to communicate it to the people. It's not like this in all cases, but I have many examples, especially in Europe, where this is the case. You have a park administration. A park administration considers what are the values that we want to communicate, and then it's the ranger's job to communicate them. And what we discussed in the especially 2-3 previous years, and what I would like really to encourage to look at against the background of what I said before in terms of mindfulness and whole experiences, is to strengthen the first point, to really consider how can we encourage, how can we enable people to interpret for themselves, and not being afraid that we lose our job in this. We still say that we should offer paths to deeper meaning, which means we should still interpret and make an offer, but we should also more encourage the people to do this on their own and get into an exchange about it, I think, to more strengthen this first part, which from my point of view was a little bit forgotten during recent decades. Another point is, those of you who are involved in Interpret Europe know this interpretive triangle, and the question where the betweenness is and what happens in an interpretive process. This is actually what happens in the center of this triangle. We often say meaning is the point which is there, and meaning is created from the different parts of the triangle. So from the sense of place, it's perceived by the people, it is perceived by us. We have our own meaning we attach to the side, and the people have their meaning, and to get into an exchange about this. So I feel that the idea of mindfulness fits quite well into this model of the interpretive triangle, which we are using since some years. Those of you who are not familiar with that, I will not say more about it. I wrote in the proceedings, which you can find on the website, again, I wrote something about the developments around this interpretive triangle. So you can look it up at the website, look at the proceedings from the spring event in 2017, and there is a longer paper about this. Another point is the stages of mindfulness. You might you know that mindfulness often is seen as meditation and, as I said, self-resilience, strengthening the personal self. But you can extend this to mindfulness towards others, and you can finally extend it towards to mindfulness towards the planet. This is, if you have the quote in mind from Thich Nhat Hanh, from the Buddhist monk, this is the view of mindfulness, which actually he had to be linked to everything around us, and also to feel being part of this planet, and being also, of course, concerned about the state of the planet, because it comes back to ourselves. So the state of ourselves should be linked to the state of the planet. So this model, it's a bullseye model, might remind those who are working in Interpret Europe since a while, especially in the training program, to this bullseye model, which we usually use to explain sustainability, where we say we have an economic development, we need to respect the social borders if we extend the economy, and in the end we need to respect, of course, the planetary boundaries, so the ecological borders. So it's a similar model, and I feel that's interesting to look at these two models and to consider how are they connected and how do they fruit each other. And this is something which I feel we could also do at Interpret Europe against the background of the sustainability discussion we had in previous years. Of course, we have the value subject, which mainly was a subject of the Engaging Citizens study in 2017, where we said we should use interpretation to strengthen certain values and not to strengthen the opposite. And you might remember this value circle is based on a big study which was done by Shalom Schwartz. You see the quote here. You might remember that there are some mechanisms we discussed within this circle, which could help us to strengthen the values we are usually calling human values. So they're all listed here. I do not want to read them now all, but it's all around democracy and respect, human dignity. It's basically the human rights. So how can we support people considering human rights? This is not to tell them you have to do this or you have to do that. It is to really look at our sides and consider how can we put this on the agenda to think about it for the people and make up their own mind about it, but at least consider it and look at different heritage sites against the background of those values. There are some mechanisms within this value circle. They are described in the Engaging Citizen study, which again you can download from the material section of the Interpret Europe website. For example, that there is a spillover effect from some value groups to the neighboring value groups. And what we suggested in Engaging Citizens, and that was actually what was so interesting for the European Union, was whether we could get links to value groups that we feel are not really helpful at the moment for the bigger than self values. So for the values that have the whole picture in mind, like for example, security. So to bring people up from these value groups to the other value groups. This is explained in the Engaging Citizens. So if you want to look this up, you can go there further. I just want to highlight I see a connection between this and the mindfulness discussion. Here you see at the bottom left now the quote for the Engaging Citizens study. And the final point, last but not least, I should say, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are part of United Nations policy, and which are very, very relevant because so many nation states agreed upon them. So this is, I would say, the biggest agreement we have in the world at the moment. All has to do with climate crisis and the Paris Agreement and these things. So the Sustainable Development Goals are basically a big collection of, it's a big to-do list. So basically big collection of points we need to put more attention on. And these are, of course, transferred into education for sustainable development schemes. This is taken from a publication, a roadmap, the actual most recent roadmap for education for sustainable development from UNESCO. You do not need to read what is written there, of course. I just want to show you, okay, they arranged now these goals in a circle. And in the center of the circle, in the outer ring, you see what they think, what learning has to do with the things. And the more you go to the core, the more you come to the core of learning. So you have 3 fields in the middle. Quite, I would say, from a conservative point of view, one field is about cognitive learning, one field is about behavior learning, one field is about emotional learning. But I want to point at this one, and this is my last sheet actually, and I was quite impressed by this because the question is always, what role can heritage interpretation play in this big game? You know, it's mainly about formal education, formal learning, and this is what they always have in mind when they are talking about education at UNESCO in the first place. But this very point, which is in this one circle, I feel is basically our field where we really can unfold our qualities more than, for example, schools can do. And it reads, build core values and attitudes for sustainability, cultivate empathy and compassion for other people and the planet, and motivate to lead the change. I'm not sure whether we are the ones who will lead the change, but I feel that this is really one point where we can say, yes, here we can contribute, and we should also actively promote this towards the European Union, the Council of Europe, or, for example, UNESCO. Some of you might know that we will have a planner course for UNESCO just starting in 1 week. And these are the points that we can discuss in that context, where we can say, look, heritage interpretation as part of non-formal learning can really contribute to this big picture of this 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So that was it. I hope you took some thoughts out of it and will take some thoughts into the conference from there. And if there are some questions, Vida, I'm not sure how much time is left. We started a little bit late. Please take the facilitation of it and tell me whether there are some questions in the chat box I could answer.
No, in the question and answer box, we don't have any questions. I think you blew us all away. You know, that one point, be not overwhelmed by stimuli or perspectives. Well, I am. I don't know for the rest. No, I'm joking. It was really wonderful. We have just some comments about how, about how amazing this whole concept is. So we have a comment that says, as soon as we bring the intangibles, we connect in a deeper level. And we have a comment that says, how important messages for our individualistic societies, the one of interbeing and stuff like that. So I think you really gave us material to contemplate on.